Seahawks fans, wherever you may be. Thanks for listening to the show. Join your hosts, Bill Alvstad and Keith Myers, as we talk Seahawks football. Hey, Seahawks fans. Welcome back to another episode of the Seahawks Playbook podcast. I'm your host, Bill Alvstad, sitting down with co-host Keith Myers, here to talk Seahawks football. We've got it in our hands now. The final 53-man roster officially released by the team. Now we can see all the cuts. We can see the players that made the initial 53. That's before practice squad is established and injury cuts and injury manipulation to the roster gets adjusted probably this time tomorrow. We'll have maybe a final for you by midweek, end of the week, for sure. Welcome in, Keith.
Yeah, there are some interesting parts on here, some different surprises. Overall, the 53 is kind of what we expected, and I think there's just 3 or 4 spots that might be a little bit different, but there's the way in which people were removed from the roster. There are guys that appear to be injured that we didn't expect them to be. And if they don't get claimed, they land on injured reserve, and the Seahawks retain them for the year, but they can't play. So
yeah, it's interesting. I think the best way to do this is just to kind of go through position groups for clarity, not only for us but for everyone else, rather than kind of jumping around all over the place. So why don't we do that? So right at the top at quarterback, Geno Smith, Drew Lock made the roster. Holton Ahlers was waived, but again, every waived player that we talk about today has an opportunity to get back onto the practice squad, and that would definitely be one of those.
Yeah, and then those guys that are once they get back in the practice squad, that doesn't mean you won't see them in a game, because with the way the rules are now, where they can elevate someone up to the roster, there are guys that got cut today that may play week 1.
That's true. That is true. Crazy. All right. Running back, Ken Walker, Zach Charbonnet, DJ Dallas. There was some speculation that based on a cryptic tweet that he sent that maybe he was in jeopardy. That's not true. He's on the roster. Kenny McIntosh made the roster initially, and
he's a candidate to go to injured reserve in 24 hours and open up a roster spot for someone else. And then that would give a chance for someone else to use that roster spot.
And Roderick Thompson was waived. He could be invited back to the practice squad. Wide receiver, Keith. There were a couple of surprises here, and one of them was the idea that Derek Young is on the initial roster. I guess it isn't a surprise, but it is a strategy. Let's talk about that for a second.
Yeah, I mean, this is a guy who has a lot of physical talents in that, but hasn't been healthy. And I thought that because of other injuries there, that the team was going to need depth, and therefore would put him on IR in order to create a roster spot for someone else. He made the roster, at least initially.
Yeah.
Which means that the team plans on using him at some point. Now, he may still end up going to IR, just like we talked about with McIntosh, and he'll be back. He'll be eligible to be back in 4 weeks. But at least for now, he made the roster, and it's not a huge surprise given that they created a bunch of packages for him. They moved him around. He was a fullback. He was an H-back. They did a bunch of things to get him on the field. And if you're going to spend the energy to develop packages for a player, they're not going to get cut.
Yeah. I mean, he struggled a little bit in preseason, had some drops and whatnot, but still a good player, still a guy you want to develop for sure.
Yeah.
Jake Bobo made the roster. I don't think that was a surprise by the time it happened, but that's a great story. Cody Thompson, his 5th camp, 4 with Seattle, 1 with another ball club. Finally made an opening day roster, and good for him. Not an opening day, but the initial cut down to the 53, and then Aesop Winston was a cut. I originally had him on my roster. I think you did.
I did have him on
as
my
well,
roster,
and we just had Derek Young starting off on injured reserve. So I think
there's a possibility that if Young does go to injured reserve in 24 hours, that Aesop Winston Jr. is the guy that gets brought back. If not, I would be surprised if he did not end up on the practice squad.
So, and then Matt Landers, Cade Johnson, Lindsey were all waived at this point. So we'll see what happens. And then Dwayne Eskridge is suspended, doesn't count against the roster. So that's the wide receiver room. How about tight ends and offensive line, Keith?
Well, the tight ends are exactly what we expected, right? Will Disley, Noah Fant, Kobe Parkinson, with guys like Mabry getting cut, and other guys that were more camp bodies. That was exactly what we knew was going to happen, unless they found a trade partner to trade someone like Colby Parkinson away. That they were going with those 3. The offensive line, it also kind of shook down exactly how we thought it would be, right? Charles Cross, Damian Lewis, Evan Brown, Phil Haynes, and Abe Lucas are your starters. Olu Oluwatimi, Anthony Bradford, Jake Curran, and Stern Forsyth are your reserves, your backups. That's kind of what we expected.
Yeah. I think, there wasn't kind of Stone Forsythe was viewed as kind of a bubble guy just because he's been less than what we wanted to expect from him. We thought there'd be more development. At least I did. And it just really hasn't been there, but he's still a good quality guy that can come in and take a few snaps for you. But I'm not sure if he's ever going to be the starter that potentially the team thought they may have had when they drafted him.
Yeah, I mean, he was a 6th round pick, so they weren't.
We'll see.
They weren't too enamored. They just knew that there was talent there if they could teach him to use it. But who are they going to keep if not Forsyth, right? Because the other tackles on the roster were not better than him. They were significantly worse. So
he's your swing tackle. Greg Island, and he had spent some time playing guard and tackle. I would imagine that he comes back onto the practice squad. And then Kendall Randolph, the offensive guard, was also let go. And then Joey Hunt, the center, was terminated as well. So
So guys that have enough years in the league don't get waived, and they don't go through the waiver process. Their contracts are just terminated and they instantly become a free agent and they could go sign anywhere. Whereas everyone else has to wait 24 hours. And if another team claims them, then they are on that team and they don't really get a choice. So it's the waiver process.
So that's the offense, Keith. What do you think about the final 53 guys that actually made it? And, obviously there may be a little bit of movement at the wide receiver spot tomorrow when injured
and
reserve guys can.
McIntosh and Young are 2 guys that very much could go to IR and open up roster spots. My question would be, okay, if you do that, who are the guys coming in, right? And I already mentioned Aesop Winston Jr. at receiver, and at running back, probably Thompson. Sir Roderick Thompson Jr. as the guy that would be that 4th running back. And if neither of those guys go to IR, both of those, the 2 guys that we talked about bringing back, will very easily just end up on the practice squad. So they're still available.
Agreed. Yeah, because I think that Kenny McIntosh is actually ready to come back to practice. Pete mentioned that last week that he would be available this week, and so we'll just have to see. But yeah, I think a guy like Derek Young is much further away with the abductor strain, and something's going to probably have to give there. All right, let's turn our attention over to the defensive side. Seattle keeps 6 defensive linemen, Keith.
That's crazy. And it's like when we did our 53-man prediction, I had them keeping 6 defensive linemen, and I had them keeping these 6, and I hated it at the time. I was like, I don't like the lack of depth. I don't like that this is all that there is, but I couldn't see another way to do it or anyone else that really needed to be on the roster. I think you went with 7 and added Gotel.
Yes.
Mainly
only
just to
for
have
the
a
reason. Exactly. That was the only reason.
Yeah. And I couldn't make it work anywhere else. So I went ahead and cut him. I still hate it. I still like, you can get by maybe week 1 with the roster as it is, but long term, you have got to get more depth on the defensive lines. There's only 6 linemen.
Right off the bat, the team did put in reserve on the PUP list Austin Faoli and Brian Monet. So those guys started training camp on that list and continue on that list. So really the only restriction then on them is that they have to miss a mandatory 4 games.
Yep.
And then they can be activated.
And they've got to pass a physical, which right now neither is close to.
Correct.
So,
but that was a way to kind of keep them around and keep spots open on the roster. They didn't use it on the defensive line now. And we can talk about the strategy around that as we move through there. But for now, it's Jerron Reed, Cameron Young, and then Dre Jones, Mario Edwards, Mike Morris, and Miles Adams. They could still make a move with Mike Morris. I don't know exactly where he's at on his progress as far as returning. And you could definitely bring a guy back in like Jacob Sykes, for example, who was released, or Gotel.
My guess is if they bring someone in, it won't be someone that was with them at training camp. You and I have been texting back and forth, looking at
been scouring
every potential nose tackle that gets released and kind of going through and looking at that. It feels kind of like when we are working on draft prospects and trying to evaluate who's out there. Instead, we're looking at people who are getting cut. And there's a couple of interesting names and few that are
Seattle is 20th on the waiver wire. So they've got to get through 20 other teams if they want a guy. And if other teams want him and they're in front of Seattle, they don't get that opportunity. That's why you sometimes see trades in this time period. It's over now, but once in a while you'll see Seattle flip or trade a player for a 7th round pick or something, just so that they don't have to go through that period of time. Okay.
So linebacker, they kept 10, which is really 9 plus Nick Bellore. Okay. And there is a name on here that was a little bit of a surprise to me. So we go through the list. Wagner, Brooks, Devin Bush, John Radigan, and Nick Bellore are your interior linemen, with Nwasu, Taylor, Mafe, Hall, and Tyreek Smith as your edge players, your outside linebackers.
That's exactly how I had it.
Yeah, see, Radigan is the only surprise to me. I had him not making it. I also had O'Connell ahead of him. So if one of those two is going to make it, I thought it was going to be O'Connell, not Radigan. But the team does really like Radigan, so maybe I shouldn't have been surprised.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, you can take a look at his play in the offseason. You can say, well, he looked like he was out of position and all that kind of stuff. But it's really difficult to tell how these teams value guys like him. I know that they, like you've said, they do. I would imagine a guy like Patrick O'Connell, possibly even Ben Burkervin, who was also cut, Levi Bell, who was also released. Those guys are going to be back on the practice squad if they don't get picked up by other teams. Now, you go look at all of the cuts around the league. There's a ton of linebackers and off the ball linebackers and so forth out there. Teams are more comfortable with what they know usually. So unless somebody's really stand out or has tremendous upside, they're going to be available for that practice squad.
And like Levi Bell might be someone that people claim, and that simply because pass rushers are harder to come by than off the ball linebackers. And I had Levi Bell making the team and Radigan not. And so that was kind of the only switch there for me.
Mm-hmm. The good news is Tariq Smith made it. I really like Tariq. Derek Hall is a name to watch. He's got that shoulder injury that just happened in the last game, and he may be a guy that ends up reverting over to IR.
Yeah, we don't know how serious that is.
And so some of these guys, what I'm saying is some of these guys, like Levi Bell, could end up back on the roster, or somebody else that's out there. So, on safety, and the defensive backs in general, a couple of surprises for me. Jonathan Sutherland was waived with an injury designation. So that he could come back, and likely will, I think.
Actually, with him being waived injured, life becomes really difficult to get him back.
Really?
Yes, because if he makes it through the waiver process, he reverts to injured reserve, but doesn't have that I spent 24 hours on the active roster before going there status. So you're done for the year. The only way to get him back would be to reach an injury settlement with him, and where the team doesn't pay him for the whole year, but they pay him like for 5 weeks, which is usually how long someone is hurt. So they pay them until, right. So if we think, okay, you're going to be hurt for a month, let's pay you for 5 weeks, just, whatever. And then they can go sign with anyone at that moment. But if they sit out there unsigned until, like if the Seahawks pay them for 5 weeks until the 6th week, after he was released, then they can bring him back. And it ends up being a weird process. And
so why
very
do you
rarely
think that they
you
did
see guys
to him, considering how well he played and apparently well thought of, and they had him moved all over the place and kind of running first team reps.
I think it's
and so forth.
I think it's just that this time of year, right? He was hurt, and therefore they thought, okay, let's keep someone like Reed on the roster instead. But by waiving him with the injury designation, what that means is that he'll revert to IR. His season's done, but they get to keep his rights into next year, and he can come back and try again.
Yeah,
he'll also have access to
for a player.
He'll also have access to the team's facilities, trainers, doctors, all of that, because he's on injured reserve. So
they did the same thing with Joey Blount. They did the same thing with Vi Jones.
Yep.
All three players are in the same bucket,
and they're all three
tough.
young players who have shown significant talent, but didn't quite make the roster. I mean, Vi Jones was injured for too much of it to really make, but Joey Blount was hurt for most of training camp, came back, played in this last game, played pretty well in this last game, but then got hurt again. And when you're already got 10 other, defensive backs that you need roster spots for. Right.
You're almost looking for a guy like Joey Blount.
Yeah.
To be able to make room for
everyone.
I mean,
it's kind of the joke that they're like, with some of these guys that are really young, promising, but hurt, at this point, sometimes how hurt are they? Right. It's like, this team's got too many safeties. So Jonathan Sutherland gets a hangnail and therefore ends up on injured reserve.
It's unfortunate though, because it's not terribly fair to the player, but also the team likes him enough to want him around the system and have him back next year. And that's kind of what it's all about.
Fair to the player. A
player wants to play. So if he's healthy,
he's got to have a job,
and he's only really going to be out for 2 weeks. He wants to be able to go to another team. He wants another opportunity. He wants to be able to
is another team going to give him an opportunity?
Who knows?
He was an undrafted
he's
rookie
unable to find out because now he's got that injury thing. I'm just saying, it's not. It's kind of a tough deal.
You're guaranteeing him a year of pay, or he can get cut, and along with 1,000 other people, and probably not ever find a job.
Yeah, but he would have been on the practice squad. Okay, so Kobe Bryant made it. There was not a question with from me, but I saw it out there that maybe he was a guy, potential trade candidate as well.
Same with Michael Jackson.
Yeah, Jarek Reed made this roster initially right now before anything else happens. He's on the 53. So the room is Quandre Diggs, Julian Love, Jamal Adams, Kobe Bryant, Jarek Reed on the safety group, Tariq Woolen, Devin Witherspoon, Mike Jackson, Trey Brown, and Artie Burns. I had Artie Burns on my roster. I was thinking about putting him on to the practice squad the day before, and turns out he made the roster as well. So at least initially, I think the team, we've got a few more moves that are going to happen in the next two or 3 days, in addition to the 16-man practice squad.
Artie Burns played really well in the preseason. Like, he was quietly,
just like last year,
really good. I thought he was better than last year. And last year he was also banged up a little bit, and that was why Michael Jackson got the starting job, was because Artie Burns wasn't healthy, and then Jackson just never gave it up. Yep. This year Burns is healthy still. He's playing really well. He earned this spot as much as anybody else. But it's kind of an embarrassment of riches for Seattle, where you've got, if Devin Witherspoon gets that hamstring right, you've got 4 guys here that are starter quality, plus a guy like Kobe Bryant, who's going to be a nickel / safety.
And
you
so
might
is Julian
go
Love.
Yeah. What's 5 guys with starter talent? You might let a team come ask for Artie Burns and see what you can get for him. Because last year he played like 2 snaps.
Yeah.
He couldn't get on the field.
It was a luxury to be able to do that, to have a guy.
They kept him around in part because he was the vet, and it was a really, really young room. Okay, he's still the vet. It's still a really, really young room, but everyone else is a year older. So he is still a luxury, but he's a good one to have. Like, at some point, he's either got to play or someone's going to trade for him. I can't imagine him sticking around in Seattle again to stand on the sideline.
But yet here we are. And he knew that. He knew coming in. He knew, right? Mm-hmm. Like, he signed a deal when he knew how stacked this room was.
Yeah. That was before
after Julian Love, after, with Kobe Bryant on the roster, Tariq Woolen. That was
before Devin Witherspoon and Jarek Reed.
Was it before the draft that he signed? Okay.
Oh, that was just before, like it was in that week leading up to it, if I remember right.
So all 10 draft picks made it onto the roster, at least today. And 2 undrafted guys, Jake Bobo, congratulations, and Chris Stoll made the roster. His job was never in jeopardy. He was one of the safest guys on the entire roster for the entire training camp period, and then signed to the 53, Chris Stoll. Everyone else had some competition, right? And so that was that's kind of nuts.
Yeah, they picked up this undrafted rookie long snapper and never looked at anyone else. Now, granted, what we've seen in the preseason, he was really good. Like, there was no problems. He even got downfield and made a tackle and was there with an assist on another one. So, like, clearly he can do the job. But just the idea that you're bringing in this unknown, undrafted rookie, and you're not even going to think about a guy like Ott or, one of those guys that are out there. And
I noticed too today that Carson Tinker was a casualty.
So he's back out there again.
He's back out there. So let's talk about the roster for just a minute. Now that we know what we've got, minus anything that comes up, I think we pretty well have a good idea of what the Seahawks are going to want to do on their practice squad too. Now, there's always exceptions. There's always going to be 3 or 4 guys that we don't have on our radar right now that end up on that list, and a few guys that we thought maybe would go to the practice squad become unavailable, or they just opt to go in a different direction. I think Holton Allers deserves a spot there. I think he's their quarterback. Thompson, the running back, I think they want to have back. Tyjon Lindsey had some kick return ability that I think the team is interested in. Landers, Cade Johnson, I think those guys end up on the practice squad. Maybe not Landers. I don't know. If there was one receiver that really didn't do too much that I was expecting more from, it would have been Matt Landers.
Yeah, I mean, he was hyped pre-camp because of his work during the OTAs and that kind of stuff. And the team was just really impressed with him. And then he kind of came out and didn't really do much. He did have that touchdown in the first preseason game. But that wasn't like, oh, I'm going to go beat a cornerback and, make a good play. It was a ball thrown up in the air. He knew where it was. The cornerback just kept running, and it dropped down to him about 25 yards before where the running back or the cornerback had gotten to. It was just a weird fluky play. But other than that, he really didn't do as much. He was banged up a little bit. And so that might be part of it too. But I would expect him back. Physically, there's a lot. I mean, the guy's tall and has wheels, and there's a lot to like there. And so maybe he's a guy that can come in and practice and work and get better and, be a valuable piece down the road.
How about Jake Bobo, Keith? What a phenomenon here. I mean, he's already like a cult classic in Seattle and on this team. Does he really have an effect on the roster?
I think so. He had touchdowns in all 3 preseason games. He was receiving passes from Geno in the one game that Geno played, which means the team saw him, out there early with the starters. And he's going to have a chance. Eskridge is out. Young is out. Eskridge is out. Right.
And Jigba is injured.
Yeah. JSN's got that wrist injury. There's, 3 of your 6 receivers. You've got, Cody Thompson and Jake Bobo, and then the 2 top guys are your 4 guys that are healthy. He's going to get playing time this first week. He's going to have an opportunity. Wow. I mean, they're very different players and very different styles of players, but the story kind of reminds me of Doug Baldwin, who was an undrafted receiver that became one of the better receivers in the NFL.
Yeah. Crazy, huh? Let's see who else. I really liked the way that Jacob Sykes played. He's very active. He was very intelligent, knew how to read defenses and all that kind of stuff. The team liked him for that. I would imagine that he was one of the last cuts on this roster. I think it probably came down to a guy like that or Gotel and keeping a guy like Jarek Reed on the roster, Keith.
Or John Radigan.
Or Radigan, yeah. So talk to me about these fringy guys and then these injury things that are happening where maybe Derek Young reverts over to IR after 24 hours and or a couple other players that potentially could happen too.
Yeah, I mean, in this particular case, especially since they've only got 6 defensive linemen, they're going to add another one at least. And it might just be one of those situations where they looked at some of the guys who had already been announced to be cut from other teams, and you had Sykes and you had Gotel, and you're like, I need one of these 4 or 5 guys. 2 that we know, these other 3 we like from other teams. I just need one of them to be available 24 hours from now. And they were okay with, it could,
it's an interesting way to
letting it go. And so that just gives them the flexibility to go ahead and cut both of those guys, knowing that they're going to be okay because there's other guys they like if both of them get claimed, and then I don't know if they will.
I don't think so.
Gotell to me was more interesting simply because of how active he was and how at a guy his size,
And
his ability to
yes.
get into the backfield at 340 pounds was kind of impressive. But, if he's gone, Sykes will still be there. So it's definitely a possibility there. With Radigan, like I said, I'm still a little surprised just because at middle linebacker, the fact that Jordan Brooks is healthy and ready to go, and the fact that Devin Bush is healthy and ready to go and was good in the preseason and stuff, those two guys opposite Bobby Wagner are probably going to be fighting for 40% of the snaps between the two of them. That's enough that you probably are okay with 3. And so I was a little surprised to see Radigan added instead of, one of the defensive ends, but I mean, it's probably one of those things they looked at it and they go, Radigan's more likely to get picked off, with the waiver wire than the other teams. Two. So he does do well at special teams.
But Levi Bell would as well, though. I think Levi Bell was literally the last cut. Like they wanted to keep him, but they just didn't have a spot today. But by the time Derek Young goes, maybe Kenny McIntosh ends up there. Mike Morris, goes to IR, short-term IR. Maybe a guy like Bell comes back. Maybe a guy like Patrick O'Connell comes back, or Sykes.
Yeah. So the only issue there is with Levi Bell, Patrick O'Connell, they're coming back to positions that are loaded.
Yeah. Oh, no, there's no question.
Why? I mean, we were just talking about that John Radigan is there for special teams and doesn't really have a path to the field unless there's a massive amount of injuries. Why would you bring back the person who's even lower than him on that depth chart at that position? Levi Bell,
because Derek Hall has that shoulder AC injury that Pete mentioned, right?
Yeah, but
so it could be Derek Hall that goes to IR and they bring Bell back.
They would bring Bell back. They could do that. They could push Derek Hall to short-term IR and bring Bell back and, still have their depth and
even if they
didn't,
linebacker. Guys like Bell, Patrick O'Connell, Sykes, those guys are going to end up being on the practice squad.
Yeah, I think so.
And they can manipulate that as well.
Mm-hmm. Unless they get claimed, unless another team saw what Levi Bell did in the preseason and was like, you know what, he's better than we thought he was. Let's bring him in. So they'll claim him off waivers and cut someone, give him that roster spot. So we'll wait and see.
Yeah. Interesting. So then they'll build the 16-man practice squad in the next, they'll be able to do that starting 1 p.m. tomorrow.
Yes.
Tuesday.
The players have to clear waivers, and the waiver period is 24 hours. So
is today Tuesday or is today Monday?
Today is Tuesday.
Thank you. So Wednesday at 1 p.m. they can start compiling that, and they will do that very quickly. They've done that in the past where they pretty much announce almost everyone right away.
They'll have like
10 or 11 or 12. Yeah.
They'll have agreements with people, and you just can't sign them until they clear waivers. And then once they do, they'll sign their, they're set up and ready to go. Then there may be some players that are claimed. It's going to be weird this year because everyone's getting cut at once. I just don't know if there's going to be that many waiver claims. So,
if there was one move to be made and you were bringing a player outside the organization in, and I assume it would be a defensive tackle.
It would be a defensive lineman.
Which player would you then cut on this existing 53-man roster to make that happen?
John Radigan.
Yeah. I mean, without using any manipulation on IR stuff. Yeah.
Yep. If you just had to cut someone because you signed or traded for a defensive lineman, I would look at the, you look at the defensive roster, and he's the one guy that is,
I agree with you, and
he's cuttable in that I think you can get him back on the practice squad, and you don't really need him right away. Now, if somebody gets hurt, you'll want him there, but that may not be week one. So that's why I would go that route.
Nick Bellure seems to be a fan favorite, seems to be a player favorite, seems to be a team favorite, team captain. But what value does Nick Bellure bring that a guy like Jan Radigan doesn't already have, and younger, under control, longer, etc., or Patrick O'Connell for that matter?
Nick Bellure is one of the best special teams players in the NFL. He offers you nothing
still
as a linebacker
at 31, 32 years old.
He was there last year. You go back and when he was healthy, because he did miss some time with injury, but when he was healthy, he was always the first one down on kick coverage and stuff. He was there making tackles, making plays. He's just really good. And that's, why he's still here. He's also a team captain. He's kind of a coach to the younger guys when it comes to special team stuff.
Team comedian.
Yeah,
there's value in that.
And so as much as I'm always, for the last 3 years, I've been, maybe this is the year where they finally move on, and they make sure that their guys can offer more than just special teams, at least in potential. He's still around. The team keeps him around for a reason, and they paid him pretty well to stay.
He's making like $4 million a year, Keith.
Yeah.
That's so pretty amazing, really. But,
they clearly value what he brings.
Yeah, I agree. Okay. Looking at this roster as a whole, how far can we go? How good is this roster?
I like this roster. A lot more than I thought I would. And I think part of that's because Jordan Brooks got healthy, and I didn't expect that. And you've seen like Trey Brown play really well in this preseason.
It allowed Kobe Bryant to move full-time over to safety.
Mm-hmm.
Not only Trey Brown, but everyone else in that defensive back room. It made the defensive back room work better by moving him, I think.
Yeah. And then seeing guys like Jake Bobo and DJ Dallas look like they could stand in and pretend to be a starter for a few snaps here or a game there.
Deeper at center.
It's just the depth. And let's be honest, at center, where Evan Brown just was significantly better than expectations.
Yeah. I am concerned a little bit on the depth now. Going into the year, I thought we were looking really strong at running back, really strong at wide receiver. I think that we still are, but it's not the depth that I thought it was, at least at wide receiver, especially with Eskridge suspended now, Tariq Young injured, and Jigba has been injured. It is injured again with the wrist. And so I'm just a little leery now of that particular situation, but everything else is looking pretty good. Even defensive tackle, the starters and backup situation, I think is okay, especially if Cameron Young is actually ready to go.
The defensive line, not just the nose tackle, but just the entire defensive line. Dre Jones, Jerron Reed, liking that combination, but Mike Morris is hurt. They're losing that. Mario Edwards is a minimum salary benefit guy who's now the starter, and Miles Adams is
five teams in 6 years.
Yeah.
Mario Edwards.
Yeah. And Miles Adams is supposed to be a key rotational cog, and we've seen that show before, and it wasn't pretty. The defensive line
He's not a good run defender.
The defensive line was the weakness last year. They completely,
retooled.
Miles Adams is the only player on this roster that was on the roster last year on the entire defensive line.
Yeah.
One guy. So they retooled the whole thing, but there's no depth, especially with Morris hurt. And Cameron Young banged
doesn't
up
play
too.
The snap, in preseason.
So there's a lot to worry about on the defensive line.
Yeah, I mean, really, they're going to end up bringing, potentially Jacob Sykes and Matthew Gotel off the practice squad onto the 53, type of a deal to shore up that, or they're going to go outside the organization. Like Keith said, there's a dozen defensive tackles out there right now in varying size and shape and form, and what they specialize in and so forth. Hopefully they can find somebody out there that's competent, come in right away and help the team. I would like to see that. I think there's more value there than having John Radigan on the roster. I like John. There's nothing against John. It's just that right now, I think the value is, up front, and we lack that a little bit. So,
yeah.
Otherwise, I'm happy. Pretty happy. And pretty much exactly the way that we thought it was going to go. Give or take a couple of spots, which happens every year. But I think
there were no big surprises. There was no nothing just completely out of like weirdness. You know what I mean? Like I would have been absolutely shocked if Drew Lock didn't make the team and Holton Nailers did, right? Like that would have been just like,
or
just
DJ
insanely
Dallas was
shocking,
off
even
and
though
Thompson came on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. And something like that, but there isn't any of that.
We missed out on the 6th wide receiver, Aesop Winston.
Well, yeah, but we both had Young going to IR rather than making the roster initially. So if we knew Drake Young was healthy enough to make the roster, which he still might not be, he still might end up in IR anyway. I would have had him over Aesop Winston. So, I mean, it really is. This was a year where they didn't have a lot of vets. They had 10 draft picks and 28 undrafted free agents in camp. That is way too many. And what it did was it led to us pretty much knowing what the roster was going to look like, because they didn't have depth from about player 56 to 90. It was pretty easy to see that all of those guys were gonna get cut.
Yeah, interesting. Cool. Well, fun show. I'm glad this is over with now. Now we can get on with planning with this roster and going forward with a practice squad group that of young guys that we can count on. So by the end of the week, we'll have a pretty good idea of where we stand with the roster before for week 1. We'll go into a prediction show as far as regular season wins and losses.
That's always
predictions.
Fun.
That's fun. We might have, I don't know, maybe we can do a show on awards, predicting rookie of the year, all that kind of stuff. That would be fun too. But otherwise, we're kind of in regular season mode after this week.
Yes, we are.
Which is good. Which is really good. All right, let's get out of here. Find Keith on Twitter at Myers NFL. You can find me at NW Seahawk. The show is Seahawks Playbook Podcast. You can find it on your favorite podcast platforms and our YouTube channel. And when you find it, hit the subscribe button. That would help. So until next time, go Hawks.
Go Hawks.
Seahawks Playbook Podcast listeners, thanks for joining us for another edition of the show. You can find us on Twitter. Bill is at NW Seahawk. Keith is at Myers NFL. And the show is at Hawks Playbook. You can listen and subscribe to the show at SeahawksPlaybook.com.